Hey everyone, Adri here with Grounded Take Gaming, bringing you a review of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Released on December 8th, this is the newest game from developer Machine Games, makers of 2014's remake of the Wolfenstein franchise, Wolfenstein the New Order, and all of its sequels, with the newest being Wolfenstein Youngbloods. Unless of course you count the VR game, which I don't. The Great Circle is set about a year after the events of the first movie, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and sets our titular hero on an adventure that faithfully follows the same globe-trotting formula as the movie franchise. We're talking evil fascist bad guys, clever quippy companions, trap-infested ruins, and a healthy dose of the supernatural that mostly comes into play at the very end. Overall, the game almost perfectly captures the feeling of an Indiana Jones movie, but competently conveyed in video game form. However, the game does suffer from several notable issues, some major and some minor. The first of these, and arguably the most significant, is the issue of performance. The game offers a wide variety of video settings in its options menu. However, at least one of these options appears to be outright broken. Specifically, I'm referring to ray tracing. The path tracing setting gives you 4 options to choose from: off, medium, high, and full. It also provides you with 3 secondary options: sun shadows, reflections, and indirect illumination. And it's the last of these, indirect illumination, that is so significant. When I optimize my settings at the beginning of my playthrough, I set my overall graphics quality to high, which is oddly the middle-most setting, and set my resolution to 1440p, with path tracing set to medium, indirect illumination turned off, upscaling set to DLSS, super resolution set to performance, and frame generation turned on. As usual, I'll put my computer specs in the description as a point of reference. And with these settings, I was able to maintain an average of about 120 frames per second, and overall decent performance, minus the occasional stutters and screen freezes, which I believe were largely related to my recording software running simultaneously. Unfortunately, cutscenes are locked to 60 frames per second, which is disappointing, but not really a major issue. The main issues come from the lighting. In the introductory section of the game, which attempts to recreate the opening scenes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is something I've been wanting to play through in a video game since I was just a wee little lad, I started noticing that indoor environments were getting brighter and brighter. This was odd to me since the scene takes place in a dark ancient temple, but by the time I reached the last room, the scene was so bright that it looked like it was happening outdoors in direct sunlight, and Indy's own hair had practically turned white. This was also accompanied by little graphical glitches along lines and edges of objects. I wouldn't say all of this was enough to completely ruin the opening scenes for me, but it definitely hurt the overall experience. But while I found the lighting during these introductory scenes to be odd, I didn't immediately conclude that the settings were the issue, since the lighting and colors of the very next scene seemed to be completely normal, and that was the case for most sections of the game. So I just assumed the brightness of the intro scenes was an artistic choice by the developer, a bad one, and it wasn't until about halfway through the game when I was playing through a snowy area that it became all too obvious something was very wrong. At one point, once again in an interior environment, the lighting became way too bright, except this time it was so bad I couldn't even see where I was going, so I went into the options to try and figure out the problem. Ultimately, I just turned off ray tracing entirely, and the problem was immediately fixed. And frankly, I can barely notice a difference in the game between ray tracing off and it being set to maximum. The value you get from ray tracing is too minimal in this game to be worth it, even if it weren't bugged. And with it being disabled, I was able to crank the graphic settings up to the highest level for the rest of the game, which made a much bigger difference in graphical fidelity than ray tracing ever did. I later found through testing that the core issue was actually the indirect illumination setting, which when set to off leads to the various lighting problems I experienced. If you set it to on, then those problems seem to be fixed, though bear in mind, I didn't test it thoroughly. But if you're planning to play the game and want to use ray tracing, then I highly recommend you make sure indirect illumination is active. Hopefully, Machine Games patches out this issue in the future, but it's frustrating that something so problematic made it into the launch version of the game. Another issue that might bother some, as it does for me, is the use of forced upscaling. The game currently only provides 2 upscaling options in NVIDIA's DLSS and temporal anti-aliasing, which is sometimes considered a form of upscaling. Neither AMD nor Intel versions of upscaling are currently supported, but the bigger issue is that there is no option to have upscaling and anti-aliasing turned off completely. You have to use one or the other. This likely won't spoil the experience for most players, but it is a bugbear for many gamers, especially now that the industry seems to be using upscaling as a development crutch at an increasing rate. Thankfully, to its credit, I suppose, the game doesn't use any other controversial systems like Denuvo's DRM. And once you get your settings locked in, the game looks pretty great. It's definitely not at the forefront of graphical development, as some sections of the game look pretty awful, and the overall fidelity can appear pretty last-gen, but I personally don't think a game, even a AAA, should be judged too harshly based on graphics. Far too often in today's industry, developers use phenomenal graphics as a distraction from poor game design, although it is a bit disappointing to see the loss in facial animation quality in a title developed by Machine Games. While the facial animations aren't done especially bad, they do look rather stiff, with an almost shiny plastic-like quality, and this is most noticeable in scenes when characters are conveying strong emotional reactions or responses. It's not a deal-breaker for the game, but it is odd to look back on Wolfenstein: The New Order to see how much more emotive the facial expressions of characters in that game, which is over 10 years old now, were compared to a game released this year by the very same developer. But, like I said, that alone is by no means a deal-breaker, and it's best that gamers not dwell on the importance of graphics at the expense of other more substantial factors. If the game plays well, is properly optimized, and is consistently fun, then having an older, less impressive graphical design is easily forgiven. So, let's talk about gameplay. Does the game play well? Is it properly optimized? Is it consistently fun? The answers to these questions are going to be a little complicated. Let's start with, does game play well? Well, yes it does, and no it doesn't. At least not always. For the most part, the experience is smooth and well designed. Combat, which I would argue is the heart of the game, is generally pretty engaging. You'll fight enemies with fists, melee weapons, and firearms, and each approach is designed to be both powerful and limiting. There isn't a single enemy in the game that can't be dealt with using your choice of approach. You can punch them, you can whack them, you can shoot them, it all works. But if you don't do it all in the right way, working within their limitations, you will be punished. All melee attacks, whether unarmed or with a melee weapon, consume stamina, as does sprinting and climbing. When you run out of stamina, you're unable to attack and your movement speed is severely reduced. And you'll run out of stamina a lot in the early game. In order to regenerate your stamina, you'll simply need to wait, while not performing any stamina-consuming actions in the meantime. This isn't so much of an issue in the late game after you've unlocked boosts to your maximum stamina and the way it regens, but in the early game, it can really suck. You really can't afford to take on too many enemies at once. In a way, the combat is very easy, particularly with the melee block and parry system, which is very forgiving in terms of timing. But nothing will save you if you get swarmed by too many enemies at once, especially not when guns enter the mix. I played through on the second highest difficulty, and let me tell you, guns hurt, as they should. You really can't afford to take many gunshots before you go down, and that's how I prefer it. Guns should be powerful. This tends to encourage a degree of stealth and strategy in all the major enemy encounters you face. Some of them can simply be powered through, but most require a degree of subtlety to survive, and the use of guns is inherently limited. The guns you find around the environment, as well as those you take from enemies, can't be reloaded. They have however much ammo they contained prior to you picking them up, which may be less than maximum if an enemy fired some rounds before you stole it from them, and once you deplete a given gun's ammo, it's effectively rendered useless, at least as a ranged weapon. All firearms can also double as a melee weapon. Indy does get a couple of special guns, one which can be permanently carried as long as he's wearing his base outfit, and these guns can be reloaded with special ammo that you can loot throughout the world, but this ammo is only obtained very scarcely. Using Indy's permanent sidearm too often will see you run out of ammo frequently. In general, you should only use it as a last resort when you desperately need a gun and have no other options. Otherwise, you'll constantly be scavenging for weapons in the environment, and the game does a great job of making these readily accessible to you. And Indy can make use of a wide variety of odd and sometimes comical melee weapons. In fact, he'll need to, since all weapons in the game have only limited durability and can be destroyed. Most melee weapons are only good for a few swings before they break, leaving the player scrambling around looking for a new one. In some ways, this is quite nice, as it varies up the combat experience. Rather than simply allowing a player to stick with just one powerful weapon, the game forces you to improvise and make do with what's available. However, there is one major downside to this system. The act of picking up a new weapon from the ground can be pretty difficult whilst in the midst of an intense brawl with multiple enemies. It can feel a little silly and more than a little impractical to spend time scanning the ground below you while also trying to dodge incoming attacks. It often felt a bit awkward, although you could always choose to simply resort to using your fists, and that's honestly a perfectly viable alternative throughout the game. One of the things I loved about unarmed combat is the sounds your punches make on impact. It sounds so similar to the punching sound effects used in the old movies and just feels like a nice touch. Though one last point on the combat is the general tankiness of enemies against guns. They can feel like absolute bullet sponges, so that notion that guns hurt in this game really only applies to the player character. I can't tell you how annoying it is to see a completely unarmored enemy take 2 headshots from a high caliber rifle to kill. I really wish the game had done a better job optimizing combat difficulty without simply making your enemies frustratingly hard to kill. And strangely, this only applies to firearms. Generally speaking, those very same enemies that can take multiple gunshots to kill can usually be knocked out with just a couple of melee attacks, which is obviously kind of silly. So combat is mostly good, with a few minor issues here and there. Overall, I'd say that's pretty solid. And while I definitely wouldn't say it's too challenging, there definitely were a few fights that had me struggling, usually because guns were involved and things escalated faster than I would have expected. So don't expect a big challenge, but also don't underestimate your enemies. They will sometimes make you pay for it. Now, let's move on to optimization, because as good as the combat is, and as nice as the graphics can be, there are definitely some issues with polish. This usually comes in the form of minor graphical glitches peppered throughout the experience, so it's not really something that's likely to ruin the game for you, but does occur frequently enough that it's impossible to ignore. There's also a large degree of visible object rendering that pops into existence when you're traveling. This isn't too noticeable in some areas, but is readily apparent in densely forested sections of the game. And it's not even like it's happening far in the distance. It often starts at only about 30-ish meters away from you, which only makes the effect all the more jarring. And mind you that I noticed this while playing at the maximum graphics preset, so there's no adjustment you can make in the options to improve this. It's just the way the game is designed. Another issue I have in terms of game design is your companion, Gina. She joins Indy early in the game and only actually directly accompanies him during certain missions, but her presence became absolutely infuriating to me, at least on a technical level. You see, Gina counts as a solid object in the world, meaning you can't pass through her when she blocks choke points. If she's going up a ladder that you're trying to climb down, you have no choice but to climb all the way back up to let her pass. She doesn't move for you. Gina don't move for no one. She's basically a solid wall. Usually, this only amounts to a minor, albeit consistent annoyance, but it can be consequential in combat. In fact, she directly got me killed twice. The one time that is forever burned into my memory was when I was in a firefight with a large group of enemies. I was using a large tent as cover to break line of sight with said enemies and recover stamina and switch guns. However, at one point, I didn't notice Gina moved right into the entrance of the tent and blocked it. So when I tried to run back into the tent for cover, I instead got stuck out in the open with no cover and multiple enemies shooting at me with a direct line of sight. Now, remember what I said earlier. Guns in this game hurt. Or, well, at least they hurt you, the player. So I tried to push through her, hoping that her AI, her programming, would direct her to move out of my way, as that was my only chance of survival. But instead, she just stood there, staring me directly in the eyes as I was gunned down in cold blood, and I'll never forgive her for it. And it just feels like such a bad design choice by Machine Games. I just don't understand what advantage there could be to making Gina a solid object that Indy can't pass through. All it seems to do is create little inconveniences for the player. Although, while it is a bad design choice, it's not something that's going to create problems for the player throughout the entire game. It only becomes an issue occasionally when Gina happens to accompany the player, which is only about 20% of the missions you do. Still, it really makes you scratch your head and wonder, why? Why did Machine Games make that choice? But, to end off my discussion of the game's optimization, I must say that despite all the small graphical glitches I experienced throughout my playthrough, I didn't experience a single game crash in my 35 hours of playtime, and that's always nice to see, especially in today's games industry. Now, let's talk about fun. Did I have fun playing the game? Well, much like before, the answer is both yes and no. By and large, the gameplay is good, especially the combat. However, there are certain elements that just didn't land for me. One of those is definitely the puzzles. The game offers many small puzzle challenges, but frankly, most of them were brain-dead easy, and those that weren't just felt kind of cheap, like I wasn't given enough information to properly solve them, so I had to resort to guesswork. When I look back on my whole experience, I can't think of a single puzzle that I remember for being truly enjoyable and clever. And then there's the side missions. Oh, the side missions. These are easily the element of the game that most drags down the experience. The game is generally separated into two types of zones. There's the shorter, smaller, more narratively driven linear zones that are extremely story dense and only take a couple of hours to complete. And then there's the much larger open world zones that will encompass several main story quests as well as numerous side quests and collectibles. And I knew very early on that these open world zones would be the bane of my existence. I compulsively ended up doing most of the side content in the first two open world zones, and it was simply not worth it. It was mostly more brain-dead puzzles with mediocre rewards and almost no narrative relevance or impact. By the time I reached the third and last open world zone, I was too burnt out to care anymore. I did a few minor missions to get a couple of useful character upgrades, and then it was all story missions for me for the rest of the game. And that was the best choice I made in my 35-hour experience. I wish I had done that from the very beginning. If I could go back in time, I'd tell myself to just focus on the main story missions and never look back. There are some important character upgrades that come from side content, which really help in the later parts of the game, but frankly, I think it's better to just turn down the difficulty if you end up struggling at the end due to lacking these upgrades. I could have cut my playtime in half or even less by simply skipping most of the side content, and it would have made for an infinitely better experience. I really wish Machine Games had only focused on making more of the narratively focused zones that really made the game shine, rather than devoting so much development time on making these open world time wasters. Granted, that might just be my personal preference, and you should really ask yourself whether or not such side content is something you'd personally enjoy. The last thing I'd like to talk about before getting to my conclusion and recommendations is the story and characters, and this is another area where the game truly excels. All of the major characters are voiced exceptionally well. This is especially true for Indiana Jones himself, his companion Gina Lombardi, and the villain Emmerich Voss. For the first several hours of the game, I found myself amazed that they seem to have gotten Harrison Ford to voice Indy, only to be shocked when it wasn't Ford at all. It's actually Troy Baker, the voice of Joel from The Last of Us and Booker DeWitt from BioShock Infinite. Baker absolutely nails the impression. He sounds like a near carbon copy of a young Harrison Ford. Making a proper Indiana Jones games absolutely requires that you get the voice right, and Baker almost perfectly sticks the landing. The one gripe I have with his performance is that his tone and intonation is too flat. Don't get me wrong, that's actually pretty accurate for a character like Indiana Jones, who has consistently been portrayed as a confident, level-headed professional. But there are plenty of times in the movies where he gets a bit frazzled, particularly when dealing with snakes, and expresses himself in a much more emotive manner. And it's this emotive portrayal that Baker never quite gets right, even in moments where he really should have. There are instances in the game where Indy is clearly supposed to express himself with a sense of passion or anger, but ultimately comes off as just flat. I'm sure doing an impression of another person's voice is an incredibly difficult task, and given that Baker gets it about 90% right, I'd say he deserves a pretty solid passing grade. Then there's Gina, whose portrayal is just good. She emotes well when she should, she's serious when it's appropriate, and goofy when it fits the moment. All in all, she's a solid companion character who exhibits decent chemistry with Indy. I'm still never going to forgive her for that door thing though. And finally, we arrive at Emmerich Voss. I did not expect to care much about this character after he was first introduced, but I think he had the standout performance of the game. He's truly the perfect Indiana Jones villain. He's slimy, arrogant, cruel, goofy, awkward, eccentric, selfish, and menacing, all rolled into one. He's that character that you just love to hate, and he may actually be my favorite villain of any Indiana Jones story ever told, movies included. So, in conclusion, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a very solid, enjoyable game, with a few areas of concern that potential buyers should be mindful of. It's definitely not perfect, but it's the only attempt at a truly big-budget Indiana Jones game we've ever had, and possibly the best we're ever going to get. But, do I recommend it? Well, if you're like me and have been waiting for decades, meaning at least 20 years, for an Indiana Jones game to get the proper big-budget treatment, then you're probably willing to overlook most of the problems I've detailed over the course of this review. And in that case, I'd say it's a pretty safe buy at the base price of $70. If you're generally familiar with the Indiana Jones franchise, but not necessarily a big fan, then I think this game is definitely worth considering, but maybe not at full price. And if you have no emotional or nostalgic attachment to the franchise at all, you should ask yourself, are you looking to play a game that's a mixture of Uncharted and Far Cry, but is generally a little worse than either of those series in terms of overall quality and cohesion? If so, then I'd say it's worth a try, especially if you can get it on sale. If not, then I'd say you can safely give this one a pass. Well, that's it for my review of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, available right now on Steam. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, consider giving it a like and let me know what you think about the game or this video in the comments below. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Adri with Grounded Take Gaming. As a friendly reminder, don't pre-order video games, and I hope to see you again next time. Take care.